Sandile Mantsoe being found guilty of murder in the South Gauteng High Court. His girlfriend Karabo Mokoena's body was found dumped in the veld, and of course this was last year. Legal expert Ulrich Roux joins us now. Good evening, Ulrich. It's great to have you with us. Firstly, I just want us to talk about the actual judgment that was handed down. One of the biggest, I suppose, challenges for this case was the fact that there was no direct evidence supporting the state's version of what happened on the night that Karabo Mokoena was killed. But the judge feeling that what was before the court in terms of evidence from the witnesses was enough to secure conviction.
Hi, good evening, Cassie. Yes, that's always the difficulty that the court faces when there is a murder involving partners or people who are in a relationship. And that is that the only person who actually knew what happened there was the accused person and the deceased person. But that's why the court relies on circumstantial evidence. And it basically builds a puzzle in order to recreate what happened that evening. And the court then makes a finding on the credibility of that circumstantial evidence. And in this instance, the court found that the circumstantial evidence provided by the state and which was brought to the attention of the court was sufficient to prove that the crime had been committed, and that proof was shown beyond a reasonable doubt. I think what's the most interesting about this case is that the accused, Mr. Mantsoe, decided not to testify, and he decided not to present the case. Now, we see this occur in cases, in our courts, but it very rarely happens when the accused person is not 100% certain of his case and not 100% certain that a case has not been proved against him. So in this instance, definitely an error in judgment, I would say, by Mr. Mantsoe and his legal team not to present his case, because the only version before the court was that was presented by the state, and accordingly the state accepted, the court accepted that.
But when we look at how the judge, worked around this circumstantial evidence and the inferences he drew and the web of lies that he said Sandile Mantsoe was telling, was that not why the defense decided to keep him off the stand, simply because there were so many lies that he would have to try and give explanation for, and perhaps he simply wouldn't be able to give credible answers?
No, definitely, and that is something that he would have considered when making that decision not to testify. But remember, a very important question that the court must always ask is, if not him, then who? So if it was not him who killed Karabo Mokoena, then who did it? His version was that she had committed suicide, that he hid the body, and that the body was charred because he did not know what to do, and he was uncertain of what procedures he should follow. And the court rejected that version and said, well, it simply cannot be true, Mr. Mantsoe. The evidence presented against you is so strong and overwhelming. I'm convinced that the deceased person did not commit suicide. So thus, if she didn't kill herself, then who did? It must have been you.
What kind of impact do you think a testimony by Sandile Mantsoe would have had, just in terms of what we know about this case and the details of that night?
Yes, exactly. As you said earlier, is that it could very well have had the effect that he would have been convicted on his own version, and that occurs a lot. Let's look at the Oscar Pistorius matter. In that case, the judge convicted him on his own version. It was also, substantial evidence that was presented and circumstantial evidence that was presented. But when he testified, he hung himself, and that could have very well been a possibility in this matter as well, and it could have been a consideration which he would have taken into account when making that decision not to testify. Remember also that an accused person has a constitutional right to remain silent as well. So he has that right, but that right must be balanced very carefully with the right that the state has to present evidence. And again, the only version that was on record was that.
The hours leading up to her death.
No, definitely, and that must be devastating for the family, and again, it would have been a consideration taken into account by the court. You know, the court weighs up the right that he has to remain silent against the right that the court has to know what happened. And why is the accused person not taking this court into his confidence and saying exactly what happened that night? Because if you are telling the truth, then surely you should be confident that the court will accept your version as being the truth.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, Ulrich, you're almost inferring that by choosing to stay silent, that was in some part an admission of guilt on Sandile Mantsoe's part.
Well, that's what the court said today. The evidence has been laid against you. It's on the record. You chose not to dispute it. You chose not to provide the court with your version and take the court into your confidence. And what is the inference that the court must take from that? Very significantly, you know, the court did not even postpone the matter for sentencing. It was heads of argument filed, and on the same day still he was convicted. So the court, when the defense decided not to present the case, the judge immediately said, well, this decision to me is easy.
All right.
There's a case on the record and you haven't disputed it.
So tomorrow, sentencing procedures, what are we looking at here?
If a person is convicted of murder, then he faces a minimum sentence of 15 years imprisonment, unless he can show substantial and compelling circumstances which forces the court to deviate from that minimum sentence. So that will be the starting point, and we'll have to wait and see. Is he going to present evidence in the form of a social worker to place his personal circumstances on record? Does he have severe mitigating factors which can force the court to deviate from that minimum sentence? But that we'll have to wait and see for tomorrow.
The one mitigating factor I can think about is that, of course, he is estranged from his wife and 3 children. Does the court pay attention to that kind of information?
Court always has to take the best interests of the minor children into account. So in other words, factors could come into play such as the minor children won't be receiving any financial support because he is in prison. Is he involved in a business that might go under as a result of his imprisonment? But all of those factors are secondary to the right that Karabo Mokoena had to life. So that is the most important right that the court is going to look at, and the court found that he unlawfully took her life away. So, you know, again, you must weigh up that right against the right to the minor children, his wife, his potential business interests, and the court will have to determine whether that forces it to deviate from that period of 15 years imprisonment.
And what about the issue of deterrence, briefly, before I let you go?
Yes, well, a clear message must be sent out to society and to the community, and that must be that if you unlawfully kill another person, regardless of the circumstances, you could face severe sentencing and imprisonment, and that is what the court must take into account tomorrow. Remember, the 3 most important factors of sentencing is the personal circumstance of the accused, the severity of the offence, and then the message that is sent out to society. And if the court strikes a fine balance between those 3 factors, it can hand down a just sentence.
All right, thanks for that, Ulrich Roux. Bring us into picture there in terms of the Sandile Mantsoe murder trial, and of course today convicted of all 3 charges against him. Sentencing in that trial will take place tomorrow.